Good afternoon. It is a delight to welcome you back to the second part on the first day of our conference, China, Latin America, and the Caribbean Infrastructure, Connectivity, and Everyday Life. My name is Joseph Alter. I am the director of the Asian Studies Center, and it's a great pleasure to be here with my colleagues, especially Dr. James Cook and Dr. Enrique Dussel Peters, and our distinguished presenters this afternoon, to join you in what promises to be a very lively and engaging conversation. Without further ado, we'll move into the presentations. I will serve as the moderator. Dr. Dussel Peters will serve as a discussant to frame the conversation following the last presentation. We encourage you to put questions in the chat feature. We will exclusively be using the chat feature to monitor and process questions. The first presentation is by Professor Ravi Madhavan and Professors Tom Roski. Professor Madhavan is Professor of Business Administration and the Alcoa Foundation International Faculty Fellow at the Joseph M. Katz Graduate School of Business. Prior to getting his PhD, Professor Madhavan spent 8 years as the manager in the information technology industry, gaining experience in consulting, executive education, and marketing. He has published a number of studies of how such enterprise recombination reshapes the global competitive context. Empirical contexts of primary interests have been steel and venture capitalism, two very dissimilar industries that have both been relatively slow to globalize. Professor Roski is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Pittsburgh and a leading scholar in the field of Asian studies. His research focuses on the development and modern history of China's economy. His recent publications with co-authors include Policy Regulation and Innovation in China's Electricity and Telecom Industry, From Divergence to Convergence, Re-examining the History Behind China's Economic Boom in the Journal of Economic Literature, Tales from the Development Frontier, China's Great Economic Transformation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Madhavan and Dr. Roski for their presentation this afternoon.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to get started, and then Tom and I are going to tag team rather, this presentation. Let me share my desktop here. Okay, so hopefully you can see my first slide. So again, hello to everyone. Thank you for being here. All right. So let me start with a brief comment on why study the electricity sector in Brazil, as well as hearing Joe's kind introduction. You may have been wondering what a management professor and an economic historian are doing together, working on the same project. So I just want to take a couple of minutes just to explain that, because I think that will help to provide the context for what we are doing here. First of all, I want to congratulate the organizers of this conference by focusing on this idea of how everyday life in Latin America is impacted by Chinese investment, especially in the infrastructure industries. And if you're thinking about industries that have an impact on everyday life, it's hard to come up with a better example than electricity. And clearly that's one reason why many of the presentations here have to do with that sector. In addition, from our viewpoint, I would say that not only is this a sector or an industry that is crucial to everyday life, but it is critical to national security, right, to economic growth, and of course to sustainability. Brazil has the third largest electricity sector in the Americas, behind the United States and Canada, again underscoring its importance. It's also got real very deep pockets of advanced technology, and in particular, two that are relevant to our discussion today is UHV transmission over long distances, and smart grid technology, which is sort of driven by digitalization, right? And of course, not necessarily in the grid sector, but a lot of other supply chain elements. The electricity sector has been a major Chinese export thrust. Getting to the second aspect of why do we, Tom and I, have an interest in this particular topic? I'd say that we're really, what we bring together, hopefully, is a macro-micro perspective on some of these activities, some of these Chinese investment activities in Latin America. Tom, of course, approaching it from a very long scholarly research into Chinese economic growth and industrial upgrading. And in the past, we have collaborated on some common topics of interest in China's energy sector, which is appropriately enough a very complex network industry. And finally, from my own perspective, what got me interested in China was this idea that rather than just being a sort of a low-cost factory for the world, China was rapidly developing capabilities or seeking to develop capabilities that I call complex capabilities, specifically in industries like nuclear power, aircraft, etc. And clearly, related areas or other similar areas like 5G, and in our presentation today, UHV, transmission types of networks. So that's really what brought us together to put our, as I said earlier, macro, micro hats on to try to develop a multi-level view of what's happening here. And here, I'd just say one other thing. I was fascinated to hear some of the discussion this morning about learning at the Chinese enterprise level. Right? There were many comments, including by you, Enrique, but as well as by our keynote speaker. And I think in this study, we are sort of beginning to get a sense of some elements of learning and adaptation at the enterprise level that we will share as we go along. That said, let me just give you a quick overview of state grid investments. I'll refer to state grid as SGCC investments in Brazil's electricity sector. And this is not illustrative of all Chinese investments. We are specifically focusing on one Chinese company, the State Grid Corporation of China. And what we have listed here is four of the most prominent investments beginning in 2010. And I won't read out all of them, but I'll just point out a couple of things. One is you'll see that the focus, appropriately enough, is on the transmission sector, right? Although with the latest transaction, the 2017 acquisition of CPFL, SGCC itself is beginning to get into the generation sector, specifically with regard to renewable energies. The two broad takeaways. One is that as a result of these investments and related investments, SGCC currently controls about 14% of Brazil's high voltage networks and 10% of transmission and distribution overall, right? So in the last 20 years, beginning from 2010, we see a significant ramping up of the state grid company's presence and clout, if you will, within the Brazilian electricity sector. And the last point I would mention here is that the overall investment of roughly about 12.5 billion US dollars in Brazil represent about 60% of SGCC's non-China investments. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the other non-China investments, including Philippines and so on. But before we get to that, I'm going to invite Tom to come in and tell us a little bit about the domestic context and the profile of SGCC in China and its domestic context. And then we'll pick back up on the Brazilian context in a few minutes. With that, over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much. So if we switch to the next slide and the next one. So State Grid is the world's biggest utility company. And just to get an idea of the scale, State Grid transmits and delivers about the same amount of electricity as the United States consumes each year. And of course, there are no nationwide electricity companies in the United States. So State Grid is truly a giant in the utility industry, and it is a very technically accomplished giant. It has substantial R&D capability, and in some areas it is actually a world leader in high voltage transmission of electricity, and also in development of computer controls over grid management. The technical level is evident. You compare the line loss in China, the amount of electricity that vanishes between the generation company and the end user is about the same as in the United States. And China in the past had all kinds of problems with electricity blackouts. I can't tell you how many factories I visited by flashlight, nor how many times I walked up 15 flights of stairs because I used to visit at an institute on the 15th floor every year, and Friday was no electricity day, and everyone had to walk up and down the stairs. Next slide, please. I think I've seen fewer power outages in China recently than I experience at home. So they are a world leader in long distance, high voltage transmission, and also in using both alternating current and direct current for long distance transmission. Let's go on to the next slide. And I should add, State Grid, of course, is a state-owned enterprise managed by the Chinese central government. Its leaders are appointed by the organization department of the Communist Party. We tend to think of state enterprises as low-G, dull, lacking in innovative capability, lacking in entrepreneurial ability. This is not true of State Grid. They have been somewhat independent, not following government instructions, but actually persuading government to enter new lines of technological innovation and then executing them by organizing groups of firms, groups of people, groups of researchers to take on very difficult technical tasks. And it's natural for them to go overseas because they have this expertise in long distance transmission. Brazil is a perfect fit for State Grid because in Brazil, as in China, you have a big country where the main sources of energy supply are at one end and the main sources of energy demand are at the other end. And so the economic geography of Brazil is very familiar to the State Grid people. Is there one more slide for me? I don't recall.
Yes, the
Yes.
domestic context.
Yes, the State Grid faces an increasingly difficult domestic environment in China. So in the past, they managed to conceal information about their costs from everybody. In 2012, I visited the head office of the Electricity Regulatory Commission, and they complained that they couldn't get any cost information from State Grid, even though State Grid is a government-owned company. But this has changed in the past 5 years because the regulators have effectively forced the grid companies to divulge their costs, and grid fees are now set in the same way that they're set in the United States. The companies show their costs, the regulators audit them, and add on a reasonable profit, and then announce prices. In fact, I just came across recently a very detailed list of grid prices for every province in China. So one issue is that the fees they charge have gone down. The growth of electricity demand in China has slowed dramatically in recent years, and also there's been downward pressure on the retail price of electricity. And so State Grid is in danger of being squeezed in between their falling fees and falling retail prices. And I do think that's the last slide for me,
Yes.
in which case, back to Ravi.
Thank you, Tom. All right, let's take a quick look at the electricity sector, and I'm just going to call out a couple of things. One is, of course, that this is a within the electricity sector of Brazil, hydro is really very big, accounting for about 64% of installed capacity. But the geography is very interesting. In some ways, according to some analysts, the energy geography is rather similar to China. The world's longest transmission lines. But what I want to highlight are a couple of very interesting features to this. I mean, if you look at this map here, the top 3 longest lines in Brazil, especially when it comes to the ultra high voltage lines, and I just want to mention that because that's an area where, as Tom indicated, this is a company that has had a great deal of innovation, if you will, right? The very quick look at the electricity market structure, in many ways similar to a lot of what's going on in other countries. Generation, transmission, distribution, and end consumption. Couple of things to call out here. There's a major Brazilian government-owned company, Eletrobras, that accounts for a significant portion of the generation and transmission. There is trading in the distribution and retail, and then the end consumption market is divided into a free market and a regulated market. Moving on, the regulatory structure. Again, so I would say, not being an expert on this particular sector itself, somewhat similar to a lot of other, the way that a lot of other countries are organized in terms of, this derives from the privatization in the 1990s. The main regulator is this agency called ANEEL, and there is a market operator underneath that and the national grid operator. The institutional evolution is in many ways quite interesting because around 2001, 2002, there was a significant shortage of electricity, as a result of which Brazil had experienced a significant amount of energy rationing. And that led to a lot of institutional evolution. The transmission system was unbundled in 2004 as a result of that. Big parts of it operated through concessions, often very long contracts, up to 30 years. But those concessions which can revert to the state. And there's a public auction process for these concessions. Okay. So that just to get a sense of the institutional evolution there. When we looked at this, what we did was, apart from reading about what SGCC is doing here, we talked to several participants in this industry, both from the Chinese side and from the Brazilian side. And in summary, here are some of the things that we took away from it. Clearly, this is a geographic context and an industry context in which Chinese companies have done quite well, including but not limited to SGCC. And we'd like to focus on 3 factors here, based on our interviews as well as our analysis of the published literature. One success factor is leveraging core capabilities. right? So specifically with regard to SGCC, it's a significant fit between the strengths of SGCC and the country industry characteristics. Again, Tom talked briefly about the UHV, the technology, right, and the pioneering work that SGCC has done. And Brazil just happens to have the geographic layout, which really makes that a significant strength, right? Which is really, the pioneering and the scaling of long distance transmission and distribution, ultra high voltage. Clearly, this is it's a sector and a business that requires a lot of investment. As a Chinese government sector, public sector company, deep pockets is one of the features that this company has.
2 minutes, Ravi.
Sure. Thank you. And the second success factor that we would point out is alignment with Brazilian priorities, which according to our analysis focuses on non-hydro renewables, the expanding the renewables, as well as the digitalization of transmission and distribution. Again, an area where a company like SGCC has significant strength. The most interesting thing for us, in some ways, something that we weren't really expecting as we began our interviews, talking to people in this, is the significant evidence of learning and adaptation. The strategy that this company has followed in terms of being extremely responsive to local environments is really something that's been quite fascinating. In particular, for example, this idea that what you really want to do from the SGCC standpoint is to do is really strategic control of their operations rather than deep operational control, right? And in some ways, it's sort of a response to what they've found in the Philippines, right, where they ran into significant political difficulties, which in some ways can be linked back to the lack of local management talent, whereas what we see in Brazil is significant local management talent with the control from SGCC being more at the strategic level rather than at the operational level, right? And of course, very specific, picking very specific emerging markets, the Brazil being one, but being very selective about those markets in which they operate. Okay. Beyond Brazil, there's some significant developments in the recent past, but I'll skip that in the interest of time. Tom, any thoughts that you'd like to share on these, some possible headwinds?
I think 2 sentences. One, State Grid's ambition extends beyond building transmission lines in Brazil and China. They have ideas about global networks of energy and electricity. And the second point is that State Grid's profit appears to have fallen about 50% last year. There was a 5% reduction in major categories of retail prices for electricity. We don't know whether that was State Grid's doing or whether they were ordered to do it by the government. We're getting different stories from different people. But if this continues, it will surely undermine their capacity for independent action going forward.
Thank you, Tom. And there's a final slide here just in terms of future research. One of the interesting, obviously there's a whole set of interesting things here, but from a management school perspective, I would say the way that SGCC has been operating in Brazil is in itself a very interesting instance of modifying strategy to depending on the local context. Specifically in Brazil, for instance, the number of acquisitions that Chinese or SGCC has made, acquiring local companies and letting local managers run it with strategic control from Chinese management. So that's, I think, a very interesting aspect, both the idea of acquisitions as a way of entering, as well as allowing local leaders to run a lot of the operation. So with that, I'm going to pause here, and we look forward to the Q&A at a later point in today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom and Ravi. A wonderful way to start the afternoon session. Our next speaker will take us from Brazil to Jamaica. Jevon Minto is Economic Affairs Officer at the Embassy of Mexico in Jamaica and an Inter-American Dialogue China and Latin America Young Scholar. He is a member of RED ALC-China and researcher on the Caribbean, Jamaica, China issues with several publications at RED ALC-China. Welcome, Mr. Minto.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me just share my screen so we could begin right here. Okay. All right. I think everything is looking okay now. Right. So again, we don't have much time, so I'm just going to go through this very quick, and so we can use a Q&A to exhaust more issues. So basically, the research that I looked at, basically the socio-economic impact of Chinese infrastructure investments in Jamaica, and I looked at a specific project. It's a multi-year project. It's called locally the MIDP, or MIDP, but it stands for Major Infrastructure Development Program Project, and you'll hear a little more about that as we progress in this presentation. But first, before we move on to there, I just wanted to provide some context around the evolution or how MIDP came about. 2013, Jamaica reached a point where we had a severe debt crisis reaching around 147% of GDP, and we had to seek external assistance. The IMF gave close to $1 billion right there. And so a pivot of the government was to launch a number of strategic projects. And one of that project was the MIDP project that they were using to sort of limit the socioeconomic impact of the fiscal consolidation efforts under the lending arrangement with the fund. At the time, I think Jamaica agreed to a primary surplus target of 7.5%, which was one of the highest in the world then. What is essentially meant was that it was difficult for the government to continue providing to carry out social spending and to spend on critical projects such as infrastructure, notwithstanding how important they were. And around the same time, based on the research that I did, a government study was released in 2013, which showed that the country's road network was in a severe state of disrepair, and it was deteriorating faster than it could be repaired. And you see a figure there of $7 billion that was needed to upgrade over 5,000 kilometers of the island's road networks to good conditions, you know. And so by that, the MIDP came about as what they would call a very transformative project that sort of combined water, sanitation, and broadband development to again leverage the government's strategic growth initiative, right? So this here is just a quick overview of what we know from the literature. This is basically what the literature review that I did sort of touched on. And we know that the role of public infrastructure investment, that it contributes strongly to economic growth. And you see some specific areas where it mobilizes certain classes of worker, agricultural workers, stimulate employment in other sectors, increase GDP per capita, and what it does to the transport economy, that your people or the citizens of your country or region can be more productive. They spend less hours in traffic. And so that matters, that you can reach work earlier and bring your goods from one region to the next, and you know the spillover effects of that. And so essentially then we know that infrastructure investment definitely has a catalytic role in sort of creating more stronger and productive economies, and is thus critical to a country's comparative advantages and structural transformation, right? So this is what a lot of, I think some presenters already touched on this. I won't even go much into this, but these are basically data to show how much the LAC region is investing in infrastructure compared to other developing and the developed world. So you can see here that between 2008, 2017, only 2.5 billion, 2.8% of GDP, or around $125 billion, were invested from both the public and private source, which essentially means there still exists a sizable gap in infrastructure, essentially. Right. So we jump over to China-Jamaica relations and what essentially is happening in that aspect, where we see that Chinese loans are being used to sort of build out the road network in Jamaica. Interesting, the political class here, they refer to them as Capit Road, which basically in Jamaican dialect, it would translate back to become carpets, which means they're very smooth and they're doing what's required. They're bringing the people where they need to be, and they're giving the country a facelift, right? It became a huge part of the recent elections, the political platform, where the government was very strident in touting the benefits that they have occurred from engaging with China. And so we're also seeing the political nature of these investments and what it's doing for political parties here. But essentially, to think about Jamaica in a more broader sense, most of the literature that I reviewed pointed to this, that beyond 1980s, Jamaica stopped investing in public infrastructure, or stopped spending on infrastructure. And so in the period that followed, we saw where a number of government studies revealed that the road network was worse than the conditions in the prior period. And today, a 2014 study, which you'll see shortly, shows that the road network here is worse than the conditions that they were found in 1999, which for me, in my case, as a national and somebody looking at development, this is an indictment on any state, that infrastructure, which plays such a critical role, you have it in the worst conditions than what it were in prior to the millennium. And so you understand more that we're facing a crisis, basically. And right here, you'll see this I got from the National Development Plan, which shows that higher level of infrastructure investment would boost Jamaica's GDP by approximately 20.6%, lead to higher payoffs in the form of faster economic growth than an equivalent investment in health and education over the time horizon to 2013. And so even the government recognizes the critical role of investing in infrastructure and what it would do for the country, but yet the country is in the worse condition than in 1999. Right. So these are basically some data you can look at. You see here this 3 classifications utilized in this survey that was published in 2014. And one has not been published, another one has not been published since. So I took liberty and said it's basically the same condition up to 2020. So right here you see good, bad, and fair. Look, 1999, there were 48% of the 5,000 kilometers of road studied in this for this research that were classified as bad road. By 2014, it was 55%. You look at fair roads, you see what's happening here is that one, the fair roads, they did not improve, but they declined because it moved from 39 to 30 by 2014. And look at the bad roads moving from 48 to 55%. And good road conditions only improved by 2% over the period. And so you can take it away from yourself that the country basically is in a critical situation where infrastructure is concerned. And Jamaica is a small, vulnerable, open economy, and so the government and the country generally does not have much resources to, spend on mitigation. So what we saw over the period, or basically what I've reviewed, is that the government sort of launched a model of infrastructure development where they were prioritizing repairs over mitigation. And it would make sense in the context that we're so open, fragile, and vulnerable to climate change that every time there's a natural disaster, the government would have to find extra funds to spend on repairing the roads. And I remember growing up as a young boy, and like every single year between around 2005 to 2010, we would have a hurricane or a natural disaster. And so every time you would need to spend more money on repairing the road so people can do what's necessary to, go back to the productive economy. But essentially what this model does is that you look over the 5-year periods, you would see here that the government was spending more on repairs than on mitigation. So it's a voted budget, what Parliament would have voted versus what they would have revised in the aftermath of the crisis. And you see here that the total over the 5-year period, 2015 to 2020, it's $11 million. This is what I think this is $11 billion, and then it came back to $20 billion after it's revised. And so you see where the country was basically putting emphasis on a very problematic infrastructure, essentially. That's until the Chinese came, right? Until the Chinese came, we saw something very important happening in terms of how the government went about doing infrastructure finances. And so there were several pull factors listed here: the affordable borrowing rates, the stable financing, and how much it allowed them to better plan and coordinate. And then again, some of what we touched on, that the country was not growing beyond 1980s, only 1% annually in the succeeding years, and then external conditions, financial crises, natural disasters. So China coming on the scene basically provided the government with a platform to sort of do infrastructure spending better, right? Again, this is just a data. By 2013, public debt climbed to a historic high of approximately 150% of GDP, which would explain the importance of the pull factor, that the rates were affordable, giving the government a chance to lower debt costs or borrowing costs while continuing to leverage infrastructure growth and development. And so this is where we are now with the MID-P, which is a major infrastructure development project, $352 million program, jointly financed by the government of Jamaica, 50%, versus the Chinese Exim Bank at $300 million or 85%. And the loan arrangement essentially stipulated, like the majority of them, that the beneficiary must be a Chinese contractor, which is something we're going to look a little more at in the conclusions of this. And that, the China Harbor Engineering Company, CHEC, was appointed main contractor by the Cabinet of Jamaica in 2013. MID-P was a very transformative project, and that's the term that the government is using it, referring to it as, because it not only included road and bridge construction and rehabilitation, but it had critical retaining walls, small community-based infrastructure works. There was a public works projects to it, and there was an installation of water lines and sewer facilities, which was the first time ever that the government was launching such a strategic project that was beyond transport development. Now, it would be really remiss of me, please don't try to read all of this, I'll just explain briefly. It would be really remiss of me not to provide some context around the emergence of MID-P, because MID-P was launched following the conclusion of a project called Jamaica Infrastructure Development Project, JDIP, which also was a multi-year project. And so by the time JDIP ended, the Auditor General essentially went back and looked at the accounts, and the findings were damning, to the extent that the country's works minister had to resign, and the CEO of the National Works Agency, which is a government body that's looking at developing the country's transport network. So the Auditor General's report basically uncovered serious breaches ranging from unaccounted to unapproved spending in the Chinese funded project, and that it was not done in a transparent manner, evidenced by inadequate capital project planning, monitoring, and record keeping. And so a huge difference between the JDIP and the MID-P project was that a new governance framework emerged under MID-P, where there was a greater focus on transparency and accountability in the contracting and subcontracting process. So something that really caught my attention throughout the research was that no matter who I spoke to in government, there was just one constant narrative, and that they were quite satisfied with how the MID-P was being executed. And I think a huge role of that was because there was a body appointed by the cabinet that was essentially looking and monitoring the implementation and the execution of the project at each phase, to the extent that who was contracted and subcontracted by CHEC was determined by a government institutions. And so the government believes that they save up to 30% between the acts and contract price for works carried out by local contractors and check under MIDP because of the governance framework that emerged under this program. Right. This is essentially I got from a government document. I think it gives a quick summary of what the MIDP was about. The MIDP had 4 major components to it. The first component is the one where I focused the research on because it was easier and the projects were larger. So it's 62%. Component 1 comprised major civil works valued at $220 million, the majority of the loan for the program. And so component 1 had 6 major projects, which I'm going to show some pictures before and after, not all of them. But essentially, this one was where the government was considering that these 6 projects could be very strategic in sort of restarting the economy in the aftermath of the debt situation that the country faced in 2013. An important part of this, is the ancillary works, because for the first time we saw water, sanitation, and broadband issues coming in a project that was financed by China. And what this does, as the president of the National Works Agency Water Commission here will tell you, is that it made it so easy for them to be able to dug under and sort of lay new pipelines, repair existing ones, and that it mattered a whole lot in that it saved them up to 30% of what they would have needed to spend if they had gone out and independently contract other folks to do that same work. And so we see real cost savings coming out of the MIDP from this one. And so these were basically the major emphasis on the MIDP. Again, when I saw the fiber optics and the cameras, I had to ask them whether is it that the Chinese were laying them, and they were very quick to tell me, no, it's not that what they're doing. It's an ancillary project, which means the government is funding that aspect based on the excavation work that check would have done. So I really had to clarify that part to you. Right. So these are some of the major findings that I saw coming out of the project. I touched on this already, but I'll just provide some little more data here. The National Water Commission, NWC, said it realized cost savings of about 30% along some road corridors where it carried installation and repairs to water and sanitation facilities, simplified contract process, as I explained earlier, and installation of repair of 105 kilometers of new pipelines that would increase distribution capacity in the city of Kingston, the capital, by up to 30 years and reduce water losses along the corridor, thereby resulting in additional cost savings, efficiency gains, plus the necessary spillover effects. And something that came out of a parliamentary hearing was that there were more developers here who felt the need that they could build apartment higher because there was more distribution capacity and there was not so much water stress on the city compared to times past. And so as we expect that throughout the next couple of years, depending on what the government decides in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic, with the new budget to come, whether the government of Jamaica goes ahead and launch a third multi-year infrastructure program, they could also include more water distribution capacity development under it. And there is basically a perspective that the Chinese will also be asked to fund that program. And so we can expect that, the distributive capacity of the National Water Commission here will be expanded and give developers more space to build their apartment building higher. And you look across the city and you're seeing that already, because the Chinese are also working on private projects, which includes real estate development. And so a lot of people are building higher in the city. Right. I hear you, but I think you said 2 minutes.
2 minutes, yes.
Okay, right. So I'm concluding now. The impact on the poverty level, I was very skeptical to include this in it because I couldn't independently go through it myself, but essentially the Survey of Living Conditions, which they have not published the data, it suggests that Jamaica recorded a 40% drop in poverty levels in 2008, which is the lowest in 10 years, and that most of the impact was concentrated in the Kingston area. The government believes that the record infrastructure spending and public infrastructure works undertaken in that year is chiefly responsible for that fall in poverty level. So of other benefits you see, it's basically we touched on 470 kilometers of improved roads, new water lines, new sewer facilities, street lights, fire hydrants, sidewalks, widening carrying capacity along the major road projects. Right, the transport economy, better for the next 40 years, greater opportunity for development, and it's expected that it will significantly reshape valuations for commercial land within the urban fence. And these are just some pictures before and after of some of the projects that MP touched on. This is the Mandela Highway. They used to call it the national park of the country because so many connects the northern part of the country to the capital. So the northern side is where tourism is concentrated, and you arrived in the country from the south. And this road right here takes you to the northern side. And so people used to spend a whole lot of time in traffic here. And they believe is that the project has significantly improved transport capacity, which means you reach your destination faster. Right. This is also another one, which is a little remote, but it was considered a major project. This is the Marcus Garvey Highway. You can see this is the after of the Marcus Garvey Highway. So you can see the carrying capacity. This is a 6-lane project. You see that it facilitates more vehicle transportation. This is a Barbican Road, which is also a major commercial district here in the country. These are after pictures when China would have gone and done its work. So you can see where the capacity along the road networks have been expanded, giving the country better access to, better road and transport facilities. This is also the Hagley Park Road, which before did not have the flyover here. It was just one small road where everything was gathering and just a street light separating everything. And so traffic from all directions coming in, and it just created a whole lot of chaos in this city. This is a South Camp Road. This one takes you more towards the downtown, where it is a major emerging district there. But you can see how much the carrying capacity along this road has been expanded. So too is the Constant Spring Road, which is also a major commercial district in the country. I know you said 2 minutes, but I'm just going to wrap with the conclusions. The conclusions that I came out of this, one that I really thought would be really useful was that Jamaica is in a weird position now because before times past, we never see US diplomats here being so involved in the politics. But the recent US diplomat who left the country after the conclusion of the Trump presidency was quite vocal about what the Chinese were doing, and that Jamaica had to be a little more circumspect in how they engage China, or it risks losing some benefits from US bilateral assistance program. And so I thought it was important to conclude that Jamaica has to be a little more careful in navigating the great power competition and onboarding the greater infrastructure development program, which we expect will succeed the mid-P program, except this one will place greater focus on climate consideration. And the reason I thought it's important that Jamaica consider it, how it navigates it important, is that the US officials came here and they decided that they made a pitch to place greater emphasis on high quality projects that favored local labor and which would have competitive, open and transparent bidding, which means they are seeing the benefits that the Chinese banks are reaping here, and that they have set up themselves in direct competition to get those projects. And so it is up to Jamaica to determine what are the local priorities and where they will make the alignments in reaping the benefits in how they engage these two actors. Also, I was very skeptical to suggest this one, but I think it is a real important issue that middle income countries like Jamaica that do not have much resources could consider suggesting to Chinese policy banks, and that instead of the 85% that China provides in its project financing in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic and amid the coronavirus pandemic, they perhaps would want to engage China to secure 100% more financing in infrastructure project, because already there was a major project that they were supposed to create in the second city of the country, Montego Bay, which they had to postpone because of the impact of the pandemic on the economy, and that it also generated a recession. And so what we know is that the catalytic role that infrastructure could play, Jamaica's small, vulnerable economy with not much resources, have to constrain how it spends on its recovery effort. And a key indicator is that if China could increase project financing beyond 85%, it would create wonders for the country. And I made the recommendation after I spoke with a senior parliamentarian who monitors a lot of the external cooperation agenda that we have. And he suggested that it would be useful, and I thought it was important to include it in this conclusion and recommendation. Also, you would notice that I didn't make much emphasis on the employment created in the projects because it just does not exist. And I thought it was problematic that you couldn't find any employment data, considering how much work they did on the governance framework to facilitate subcontraction. And a lot of local firms were able to subcontract, but still nobody took the time out to go in the project to sort of create, a dichotomy between how many locals versus Chinese were employed in them. And those are really important data that could go a long way in helping not only Jamaica, but China to do their public diplomacy better, to suggest how much they are helping Jamaica and Jamaican nationals to reap economic benefits from their funded project. And so that's where the presentation concludes.
Thank you, Jevon, Minto. A wonderful detail and broad perspective. We'll move straight back from Jamaica to Brazil again. Our next speaker is Celio Hiratuka. He's currently the Vice Director of the Institute of Economics at the State University of Campinas. He's also the coordinator of the Brazil-China Study Group at UNICAMP and researcher at the Center of Industrial and Technology Economics. His research interests include the Brazilian industrial structure, international trade and foreign direct investment, economic development, and Brazil-China economic relations. Welcome, Celio.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this seminar, in particular to Enrique, Ariel, James, and Joseph for the organization. And I expect that I can discuss my research in here. I will start to share my screen. Just 1 minute. Okay. Okay. Well, this is the structure of my presentation. I will start by giving a general context of the perspective of the international expansion of Chinese infrastructure companies, and on the other side of the deficiency of infrastructure in Brazil. Then from different sources of information, I will outline an overview, a general overview of Chinese infrastructure investment in Brazil. And in the third point, I will highlight some new trends identified mainly in the last 3 years in new Chinese projects. And finally, outline some final remarks, highlighting the main conclusions on some policy suggestions. The analysis of infrastructure projects in Brazil was carried considering two main aspects. The first was the changes in the Chinese development model and expansion of its infrastructure companies in the international market. And the second is the historical deficiencies and aspects related to the most recent economic situation in Brazil. Starting with the first point, it's important to highlight that throughout the process of changes and reforms initiated in 1978, the expansion of infrastructure has always played an important role and has supported the set of structural transformation that consolidated China as the largest global producer and exporter of manufactured goods. It was also one of the fundamental levers to maintain the high levels of investment and sustain China's high growth rates, especially at critical times in the global economy. But in the process of spending the internal infrastructure, Chinese companies have also accumulated important skill to design, manage, and implement increasingly complex projects. And since the beginning of the 2000s, these companies have been increasingly active in the foreign markets. It's important to remember that in the reaction to the Asian crisis of 1997 and the great financial crisis of 2018, the Chinese policy economy reinforced the expansionist policy to keep investment at high levels, supporting the incentive to spend infrastructure. But in domestic growth, with the slowdown in the domestic growth from 2012 in China, the internationalization of its company has become even more relevant in order to reduce the idle capacity and also to provide a transition to an economy with less capital intensive, a more knowledge intensive, led by sectors like 5G and Internet of Things and international intelligence. In this graph, it's possible to see the fast increase in revenues generated abroad by Chinese infrastructure companies. For example, the turnover of overseas contracted projects of China's enterprise increased from 8 billion in 1998 to 145 billion in 2015. It's represented an annual average growth rate of almost 20%. It's also possible to verify that it's a movement basically toward developing countries, avoiding in the first time the most direct competition with the companies of countries companies of developed countries in our markets. One can also see the importance of China's infrastructure companies in the international market from the information from engineering new records data. This publication lists the 250 largest companies in terms of international construction contracts. According to the data, for 2018, China had 76 companies in the ranking with a total revenue of $118 billion. This amount corresponded to 24% of the total revenues of top 250. It's also possible to see that despite the rapid growth, Chinese companies are still behind the largest companies in Europe, with accounted for almost half of the international revenues in the ranking. This table confirms the importance of Chinese companies in the ranking, but it also shows that the average degree of internationalization of Chinese companies is still relatively low, especially due to the size of their domestic markets, but also due to their late internationalization process. From a regional point of view, there is a concentration in Asia and Africa, while Latin America has just 6% share. Therefore, it was observed on the Chinese side, the search to expand its performance in the international market. But on the Brazilian side, it's important to highlight the combination of some structural aspects with some more short-term issues. This structural aspect is related to the chronic deficiency of investment in infrastructure in Brazil. Since the debt crisis of the 80s in the last century, throughout the period of privatization and more liberal policies of the 1990s, Brazil has faced difficulties in sustaining investment in infrastructure. This graph clearly shows the low level of investment in infrastructure in Brazil, even when compared to Latin America or Africa. Even in the growth cycle, allowed by the commodity booms between 2004 and 2013, the increase in public and private investment in infrastructure in Brazil was relatively modest. The higher GDP growth rates were closely related to consumption expansion, and the attempt to increase investment and to articulate infrastructure expansion with a more investment-led expansion was advanced very slowly. However, with the recognition that the consumption expansion could not sustain growth without being accompanied, followed by an increase in gross capital formation, the Dilma Rousseff government begins to seek for a new vector of expansion. It's interesting to highlight that this movement occurred at the same time that the diplomatic rapprochement between the two countries reached its peak with the visit of Xi Jinping in 2014 and Li Keqiang in 2015. In this visit, numerous agreements and letters of intent were signed, several of them involving the infrastructure sector. For example, the Bioceanic Railway, a project for linking Brazil Atlantic littoral to ports on Peru, was considered one of the main projects that could be led by Chinese investments. But until now, this project never left the paper. The economic crisis and the fiscal constraints that Brazil has plunged since 2015 have kept public investment in infrastructure at low levels, while the more liberal policies of Presidents Temer and after Bolsonaro have reinforced the bet that private investment could help to recover the economic growth. In other words, the expectation that Chinese investment could play a relevant role in Brazil has always been present since then. So the assessment of Chinese investment should consider this context, where expectations regarding the role of Chinese infrastructure in Brazil have been quite high. It's possible to note here also the structural difficulty in increasing investment in infrastructure in Brazil. The 1.7 level 1.7 of GDP level achieved in 2019 is well below what would be needed to overcome the existing bottlenecks. According to the Brazilian Association of Infrastructure and Basic Industries, the annual rate required to solve the existing bottlenecks in Brazil should be more than 4% of GDP for 10 years. In terms of values, it would represent 284 billion per year. There is a difference of 160 billion reais compared to what was actually invested in 2019. Well, and then to moving to the assessment of the importance and impact of Chinese infrastructure investment in Brazil, I consulted different sources of information. In addition to the literature review, I organized data based on information from Brazilian Central Bank, but also I analyzed some data from the private participation in infrastructure database organized by World Bank, and also I have some semi-structured interviews with some important agents like the Brazilian Association of Infrastructure and Basic Industry and the invest promotion agents of the state of São Paulo. Well, first, considering the data from the Brazilian Central Bank, it's possible to see here that China goes from 0.2% of the total stock of foreign investment in Brazil in 2005 to 4.1% in 2018. In sectoral terms, it's possible to verify that this that sectors associated with infrastructure become the most important, reaching 55% of the total, with the electricity sector accounting for 55%. There is strong concentration then in the electricity sector. The same concentration can be verified from the PPI database. From this database, projects in Brazil that had Chinese companies as investors were selected. And overall, I found 25 projects. And it's possible to see the almost absolute predominance of projects in electricity energy, as already anticipated by FDI data. Within this project, the concentration of straight grid is important. Of the 25 projects listed, state grid was responsible for 20, with a total value of 4.9 billion. China Three Gorges, although having 5 projects, especially in transmission, in power transmission, was very significant in terms of values, totaling about 5.4 billion. Then, if you considering all the period from 2004 to 2019 of the total investment registered in the electric energy in the PPI database in Brazil, the Chinese companies were responsible for 8.3%, and 70.6% when considering the most recent period between 2013 and 2019. Considering just the power transmission segment, the importance of Chinese investment is even bigger, reaching 30%, 1/3 of our investments considering the 2013-2019 periods. Then it's also important to call attention to the high participation of BNDES as the financial banking in these projects. Unlike other experiences in Latin America, where Chinese banks had a large participation, in the case of Brazilian electricity sector, BNDES was the main player. Also noteworthy is the almost absence of other sectors at the base. According to interviews that was conducted at BNDES and the Brazilian Association of Infrastructure, the existence of a more structured regulatory and planning environment in the electricity sector compared with other sectors contributed to this concentration, which allowed a good risk-return combination for Chinese investors. However, the survey of new projects in the most recent periods shows some interesting trends. This is the table that show the main projects from 2018 to 2019. First, it's possible to highlight the participation of large Chinese state-owned enterprises such as CCC and Power China, which have long shown interest in carrying out projects in Brazil, but different from the expectation created in the past, the projects highlighted in the table are important works, but of a smaller size in relation to the large railway projects that came to be studied and announced as possible showcase of the new wave of Chinese investment in Brazil. I think that this can sign a more gradual and careful entry strategy, including partnership with Brazilian companies as minority shareholders. Second, the increased participation of urban mobility projects. There was much expectation of major railway projects which have not yet come to be reality. However, urban mobility projects have minor environmental impacts and important effects on the everyday life of large urban centers like São Paulo and Salvador. Third, the presence of private companies, both in São Paulo and Salvador. The presence of BYD is observed with projects of light rail vehicles. So it's important to highlight that these two BYD works in Brazil can become important showcase for BYD operations outside China. of its Sky Rail project, developed and designed by the company's R&D department. Sky Rail first.
Two minutes.
Okay, I go into the end. Sky Rail first commercial operation took place in 2017. The company has since signed a contract with cities such as Guilin, but still have few operations outside China. And fourth, the importance of regional initiative as a platform to increase investments in infrastructure. It's worth mentioning the case of São Paulo, that opened an office for the investment promotion agency in Shanghai that contribute to attracting investment in the São Paulo metro projects, but also was important to Sinovac's partnership with Butantan Institute for the production of vaccines against COVID-19. Then going to final remarks, it's important to highlight that contrary to the expectation at the height of the diplomatic rapprochement between Brazil and China between 2004 and 2015, there was not a big wave of major investment infrastructure projects by China's companies in Brazil, but it's possible to say that Chinese investments were significant and important considering the context of crisis and retraction of other international investors, especially in the energy transmission segments. The major projects in railways like Biocentric Railway, where initially high expectations were placed, on the other hand, did not materialize until now. There are some signs of diversification in the infrastructure segments where Chinese companies have been operating. For example, transport logistics in the urban sector gained prominence. In these segments, it's important to highlight there are lesser environmental impacts than those carried out in the non-urban areas, and also more impact on the everyday life in the great urban centers like São Paulo and Salvador. Some companies that have prospected some large projects in the past, including in the railroad sector, opted for smaller and less complex projects, often with Brazilian partners, indicating a more gradual strategy to the economic and regulatory environment of the country. And in terms of policy recommendation, it's important to restore the medium and long-term planning capacity of the Brazilian state to identify and support the main strategic projects and the priority infrastructure investment that promotes structural change and environmentally and socially sustainable development. Private decisions do not necessarily guarantee the degree of coordination or articulation necessary for these objectives to be met. It's necessary, therefore, to overcome the dichotomy that in Brazil is often assumed between state and private action. This issue does not apply only to attracting Chinese investors. However, the information gathered in my research indicate that government coordination and planning activity capacity certainly due to its all development model tends to be seen as a positive aspect by Chinese companies, as they would demonstrate a greater local commitment with long-term projects. So resuming the planning and coordination capacity and elimination the fragmentation that often exists between the several spheres related to planning and regulatory rules that organize the relation between the state and the market, it's important. Of course, provincial initiatives are certainly important, but it would be important to have some degree of coordination with the federal government in the future. Also, in the future, it will be important to make more effective use of Brazil's unique position in Latin America in relation to China, for example, as part of the BRICS, making better use of the financing possibility offered by new development bank, but also in other funds and multilateral development banks where China has a relevant role. The role of BNDES cannot be weakened. On the contrary, BNDES continues to be a fundamental bank to finance and structuring infrastructure projects and can carry out joint operations with other multilateral and Chinese development banks. And finally, despite the recent interest in urban mobility projects, there are other projects in more sensitive regions that can attract the attention of Chinese companies in the future. So the environmental issue is increasingly important in the Chinese development strategies, and the country has advanced in the guidelines for the operation of its banking companies abroad. The Brazilian environmental license system for infrastructure is relatively modern and rigorous until now, with high parameters in relation to other developing countries, and it's important to prevent this structure from being weakened. Thank you for everyone for the attention, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Many points of intersection and overlap with the other presentations this afternoon. Our final paper and presentation is by Omar Narea, a Peruvian economist with postgraduate studies at the London School of Economics and the University College London. After working for 7 years at the Ministry of Economy, he joined the School of Public Management of the Universidad del Pacífico as lecturer and research associate to the Center for China and Asia Pacific Studies. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you. I want to share my PPT. Please let me know if you can see the presentation.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. This is a pleasure for me, and I feel really privileged about present what I've been working in the last year about researching about the Chancay port. This picture, I guess this is not the proper picture for the presentation. I mean, if you want to see the large mega project, probably the port of Chancay could be depicted with a picture with this. However, we also want to focus on the everyday life around Chancay, and that's why I'm thinking this picture also could represent properly my title, which is the gap between mega projects and everyday life, the case for the Chancay port. My objective is to explore what are the ongoing and expected transformations related to this infrastructure Chinese project. I try to address these questions. Will this transformation be shaped by the Chinese evolution of infrastructure models? And to what extent does everyday life is changing by the scale of the new infrastructure around Chancay port? So first, see a bit about Chancay. Chancay is really close to Lima in the north. It's only 80 kilometers. The first stage of the construction is almost 1 billion, 1.5 billion actually. The total one will be for 3 billions. Nowadays, we are in the first phase under construction. It will finish the next year probably, expected with COVID process and all. And this is a picture of the infrastructure. This is a new port. This is a tunnel, and this is the entrance complex. So it's quite a sophisticated infrastructure to the port system in Peru, and is shared by the COSCO Shipping Chinese company and the Volcan Mining company in Peru, 60% and 40%. Well, let's say this means a mega project for Peru, for the Peruvian port network. If we compare the scale of the transport freight by Chancay, we will locate Chancay in the second position, really far from Callao, which is the main port in Peru, but will overpass the Mataroni, which is the current second port in Peru. So it will make a hit really fast in terms of the capacity of the Peruvian transport navigation system. And if we compare with ports in Latin America as well, probably Shanghai will reach the top 10 major ports in Latin America, and probably the fourth one in the Pacific Ocean in this continent, okay? That's why we said that Shanghai will meet a really change in terms of infrastructure. Our theoretical framework is trying to address the approach of mega projects. I try to use the approach of the Omega Center, which ran a research project of 30 mega infrastructure around the world and try to pick the best or the main topics about what are really pursuing a mega project. Maybe the most important thing about this is that the core or the heart of being a mega project is being an agent of change. A mega project don't only focus on provide infrastructure, actually they focus on provide a legacy. So if we see this small graphic, mega project pursue really long-term and medium-term impacts, trying to produce a legacy goals, change in culture or change in global recognition. You recognize Shanghai from being, for instance, the most important port city in the world, and Rotterdam for Europe, for instance, or vision goals as well, trying to promote a really territorial impact in terms of economic growth of social fairness. So the approach of mega project try to depict that Shanghai will have a large impact beyond economic or just a short-term contract of construction. Again, mega projects are game changers. They create new policy frameworks, new norms, and new institutions. They want to promote change, but they change everything basically around the territory, even at the national scale. The territorial impacts are also beyond the physical boundaries of, in this case, of an infrastructure. It's not only in Shanghai, and they create new infrastructure in terms of institutions, like a new metro authority or a new port authority, for instance. So they are game changers as well. And if we try to depict the most important characteristic or component of a large or a mega port project, I try to synthesize the three most important features. The first one is the multimodal transport. And the second one is that ports are really integrated to the special economic zones, and the massive environmental effects. The 10 more important ports in the world represent the pollution of the whole Germany, for instance. So they are massive in terms of territorial effects. And I try to depict this using the Shanghai port as an example. In this picture, you can see the Shanghai port, which is here in the southwest. To transport the freight, they use a new road, a new bridge, actually, who reach either the highway to reach Shanghai city or either to railways. Because 68% of the container throughput flows in out Shanghai. So you really need a strong and modern multimodal transport system, which rely, in the case of Shanghai, as railways, because you need to reach almost distance of 500 kilometers away from the port of Shanghai. So a major feature of a mega port like Shanghai, which is the top in the world, is that you need a strong multimodal transport system. The second one is that it's not that you only want a port because of a port or because of economy. You also have a really strong economic framework or plan or development plan behind. The example of Shanghai, for instance, is that Shanghai pursued 5 centers goal. One core is be the world economic center, the financial center, another is being the shipping center, and the trade center, and the innovation center. So you really need a strong shipping center coupled with important special economic zones to develop and unleash the potential of the trade for China in this case. And another one is related to, again, the environmental effects. This table by the International Council of Clean Transport try to compare the Chinese regulations in terms of sulfur oxides standards. And actually, China kind of moved to reduce ships' emissions, adopting ship emission control zones in the Yangtze River Delta region in 2016. If we see above, we can find that China is still in 5,000 ppm, which is the measure for sulfur oxygen limits. But in the north of Europe, the Baltic Sea pursues 1,000 limits. But still, it shows that China's ports are really producing or agreeing with ship emission control areas and really strong implementation plans. So the cases of study, this case study tried to analyze the Shanghai port's transformation based on these parameters of a big mega port project. It doesn't mean I have to follow exactly what those big projects have reached, but it means that we can analyze in those terms if mega project has the same, for instance, aspirations. And in the terms of the multimodal transport, I try to compare the Shanghai project with Callao, Matarani, and Paita, which are the current 3 most important in the Peru system. And the news is that there is rails in 2 of those 3 ports. Paita, which is more for freight of fish oil, agro, has not a proper rail system. It relies more in a long interoceanic highway, which is almost for reach 600 kilometers from Paita. So it can reach really the highland and the Amazon area to the Pacific in an important highway. Whereas Callao and Matarani rely in railway because they have important minor centers around there. Okay, so I did some research about what the natural resources using space data, and my conclusion on one point I am trying to explore is that Shanghai is more expected to produce agro exports, fishery and goods, of course trade from China, but in comparison with Callao and Matarani, there is not enough large mine project around Shanghai. So we probably won't rely on railway projects. So we cannot compare like Shanghai and Shanghai in terms of a really fast and modern connectivity infrastructure. The second one is about export processing zones. Again, I try to compare with the 3 more important ports in Peru. Matarani and Paita have especially developed economic zones. Both try to give government exonerations to income tax and the exemption to import fees if you put a company in that area, but they are not well developed. They don't produce big changes around these economic zones or special economic zones. And Callao has not that approach as well. So it's not a really far strategy for the Peruvian economic development. However, there is a new project. Actually, we try to produce this project in the short run. Just 43 kilometers from Shanghai, there is a new industrial park of Ancon, which try to transform the north economic and productive structure of Lima. So in a really close distance, again, 43 kilometers, we will have a port, multi-Pacific port, and a really new industrial area. So probably Shanghai have the more opportunities in Peru, or even in South America maybe, to evolve as a hub, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of industrial development. And finally, in terms of the dimension closest to the everyday life, I'm agree with the presentation that the closest mega project to the people life is energy. You know, in transport, of course, once you pay the fare, you use it, but you consume energy every day. But in terms of trade, or in terms of commerce, or in terms of ports, this is not something that you can face day to day. No, probably the everyday life are more locals than the aggregate that you receive in terms of the reducing price of your import, or the job of your company exporting to other countries. Okay, so I try to focus more on the environmental side because of this. And what happened in this map, I used the map that tried to connect the industrial park of Ancon with Shanghai port. And what we found is what happens in various parts of this area of Lima. First, you can see in the above picture that there is 30 years of a point as a sewage water and dump. So in informal settlements, people use an important wetland to just reduce informal garbage. And also they use it as informal farms, which produce bad smell. So people who live nearby feel not only the visual effects, but also the bad smell. Students could receive, a really important impact over their own well-being in those terms. So this is happening before the Shanghai port. But
just about 2 minutes left.
Thank you. And the second one is that this is not a really small area. Actually, this is a huge one. This is a local wetland right before the Shanghai port area. But what happened in 2011 is that a Shanghai origin person, Marino Marikawa, went back to Shanghai, and he realized that contamination really was increasing in the area, and he produced an important project for recovery. And after getting some small support from the municipality, he raised a project, and the people start to understand that it's possible to change the area thanks to really basic technology. And local people start to believe in this project, and they start to support Marino and join them as volunteers. So thanks to Marino, again, a local person of Shanghai who went back after 20 years because the Shanghai area don't provide education opportunities. So you have to go to Lima and later go to overseas to get really important levels of skills and education. And he used that knowledge to raise a new project in terms of trying to reduce the impacts of the humedal into the humedal of Cascajo. So now he's getting some support from the proper local community to keep the humedal under control. So those are the conclusions. This is one focusing on everyday life. Shanghai project offers to Shanghai people really modern grade infrastructure. This tunnel is actually one of the most modern infrastructures in Peru. It's a surface infrastructure. We have a metro project currently, but they also have a metro project here. So the ambition is high as well. They want to challenge the houses around, and they put the tunnel under the earth to reach the port area. Okay, but this is gray infrastructure, whereas people will expect also some green infrastructure, but this is not the case from this Chinese infrastructure. People say, oh, okay, what are the environmental supports from this project to our communities? And there was also two conclusions in terms of the whole infrastructure impacts. I think Shanghai is in a good position to set up a special economic zone related to Ancon Industrial Park, which is really easy to understand in terms of the Belt and Road approach of economic developed areas and focus with international markets. So there is plenty of opportunity about this. But maybe if we see what's happening in our Peruvian economic productive structure, Shanghai port freight is related with non-mineral bulk. So we could expect highways rather than railway networks, which also will have an impact in terms of the communities. It's not the same highways than railways, especially because of the sensitive area in terms of environmental resources around Shanghai. So those are my conclusions. Thank you for your time, and I hope some questions to interact with you.
Thank you very much, Omar. Wonderful presentations by all four scholars. And without further ado, I will turn it over to the discussant for this afternoon. We have approximately 30 minutes for discussion. I would encourage each one of the presenters, the questions that have been put forward are visible in chat. We will also draw specific attention to some of those, but I'll turn it now to Dr. Enrique Dussel-Peters to lead off the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm very happy and very thrilled to participate as a discussant, and I'm very honored. No, I mean, I know all of you that have presented, and it's a real privilege to listen to the analysis from a very heterogeneous perspective, no? So we have economists, macroeconomists, microeconomists, international relations people discussing infrastructure projects that provides us with a lot of different results. No, we still have to consolidate some of these results to achieve some homogeneity, if this is possible. No. By the way, I would like to say hi to Bettina Granzo, who participated in Berlin several years ago in discussions with Ariel Harmony, and she was one of the persons, not the only one, I do not want to make it responsible, but who put the seed highlighting the importance of infrastructure projects in China before the Belt and Road Initiative, by the way. No? At that time, it did not exist. Regarding comments, no? So I think this is a great opportunity on the one hand to contrast experiences in similar sectors, but also in similar countries. No, it would have been fantastic, but this was not possible due to the time schedule in China to include our friend and colleague New Haibin in this discussion so that we could put together Celio, Ravi, Tom, and New Haibin discussing the topic from different perspectives, the case of Brazil. No, so we expect different results. I would tell you on Brazilian, China experiences, learning experiences, etc. No. A second topic that I would highlight in general is to make an increasing effort. I know it's difficult. Today in the morning, I highlighted there is practically nothing on this. No, the impact of these infrastructure projects in everyday life. And in the morning, I try to highlight that, again, there are direct impacts, indirect impacts, and that we could discuss this from a macro perspective, meso perspective, and micro perspective. This was explicitly also mentioned by Ravi and Tom in their presentation. No? So it would be great if all the four of you, and we will invite also the authors in the morning, to do an explicit effort, even if this is difficult and even if the conclusions might be somehow adventurous, if you want to push you in the direction of, well, what is the effect? What are the benefits in terms of everyday life for the local, the regional, the national populations? Again, there might be some positive and some negative, as Omar just mentioned at the end. No? A third general topic would be, again, as an invitation to be more specific regarding the discussion and definition of what is an infrastructure project. No? Again, it is not a matter of an infrastructure project is good and foreign direct investment is bad. This is very clearly not the case. But as part of the work we have been doing at the Academic Network of Latin America on China, we have been inviting, and in some cases very critical, distinguishing infrastructure projects with foreign direct investment. In the morning, I highlighted the issue of infrastructure projects as a service in which you have a contract. No, it can be public-private, private-public, you can imagine different ways, and in which the property is always in the hands of the client. No? I believe several of the cases we saw today in the afternoon, the case maybe of Brazil, the case of State Grid, the case also of Costco, are foreign direct investment projects, even if they are in infrastructure. No, so we have, I don't know, other cases, foreign direct investments of Hutchinson ports, etc., in which the property will be in the future in the hands of Costco. No, it's not a process in which you have a client, etc., etc. Think about this. Again, this is not good or bad. And finally, some very specific comments and particularly questions for the respective authors, having in mind the discussion of today in the morning and having read the submitted documents. No, so for the presentation of Ravi and Tom, why does State Grid invest in Brazil? No, is it mainly geography, as highlighted in your presentation? If it would be mainly geography, I could imagine why didn't State Grid invest in Australia or in India, that you know much better than many of us, or even in Canada? No, why Brazil? No, why this high concentration in Brazil? And apparently State Grid continues with this process. No, it's not that they want to sell their assets and go to India or to Australia. No, you could say Australia is closer or whatever. No, it surprises me. I don't know if you have an answer. And it would be also interesting to analyze this intra-firm learning process. No, what we have been doing, again, at the firm level, I remember case studies, for example, in the automobile industry, FAW, no? First Automotive Works, that invested foreign direct investment, not infrastructure in Mexico. It was fantastic how in 2007, 2008, FAW invested heavily in an infrastructure that did not exist in China. Numeration of parts. In 2020, this might be a joke, but in 2007, 2008, the Mexican plant requested for windshields and they received tires. No, I am joking. But so this interactive learning process is, I believe, very interesting. I had a couple of other questions. I leave it like that. Jevon, Minto, no? A very interesting experience, I think, regarding this MIDP and JDIP projects, no? Interesting, it would be interesting at some point in the future to reflect with and integrate these experiences with other Latin American experiences. Today in the morning, we saw the case of Ecuador, Brazil, Mexico, etc. No, it's not good or bad, but simply attempting to learn from these experiences. No, it would be interesting, maybe even adventurous again, but to link more precisely if these infrastructure projects from China are linked with this impressive drop in poverty. No, as you said in your presentation, you hesitated. Think about it. Are there some direct links, or you throw it simply to the arena and the audience like myself do whatever you can with that? No, I'm saying it jokingly, but and finally the issue of transparency. We discussed this today in the morning also. I didn't completely understand from your paper and your presentation if there is an ongoing a political discussion of a new government that in which the new government requires more transparency in these infrastructure projects from China. Could you be a little bit more specific what the political discussion on transparency is about? Celio, Hiratuka, you have been working on these topics for quite some time. Simply, very briefly, in page 13, you mentioned that there is a structural difficulty in increasing investments in infrastructure in Brazil. I don't know if you could be a little bit more detailed and specific what you mean with this. Of course, I know that you have more of a macro perspective. It would be fantastic if it maybe today or in the next versions, you could include also a micro version of this. Is there a micro reading of these infrastructure projects in Brazil from China, or not. And finally, Omar, very interesting, the case of Chancay. Again, it doesn't make it good or bad. I think it's more of a foreign direct investment. And if it is not the case, simply let me know. And I believe, Omar, I don't know if you are aware of discussions going on of other Chinese ports in Latin America. No? In the literature review, it would be very interesting to integrate differences of the Chancay port with Puerto Chiapas, Puerto Lázaro Cárdenas, but other parts of Latin America. No? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Enrique, for a very broad and comprehensive and integrated synthesis. I think the best way to approach the discussion is to follow the order of the presentations and allow each presenter to respond to the points that Enrique has put on the table and connect those to any of the questions in the chat that relate to that focus. I think that there is an overlap between some of the questions in the chat and the points that Enrique has brought up. And I think that is an efficient way to move the conversation forward. So I'll turn it over to Ravi and Tom to start off, then we'll go to Jevon and Celio and Omar. Thank you.
Tom, do you want me to start off with a couple of thoughts?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So thank you. First of all, I think it was a fascinating set of presentations. I learned a lot from all of those. And thank you for the questions, Enrique. Let me just touch upon you raised the question of the why invest in Brazil, right? From the SGCC standpoint, and I'm sure Tom will have more to say about this as well. But my own analysis suggests that SGCC's global strategy sort of went through various phases, right? So if you look at the list of places that they've invested, that includes a lot of electricity operations in Europe, Australia, and so on. But some of our interview participants gave us to understand that in the last year or so, they've sort of realized that some of those early investments are probably dead ends, right? For a variety of reasons. One, I think the absence of growth, and the other is political factors, right? So the takeaway that we had from some of our discussions is that they do see Brazil as kind of a sweet spot, right? Where there's an opportunity to grow, right? The policymakers are ready to make the investments, and there is a fit between the technological capability that State Grid has in these very long distance the UHV type of networks, right? Which is not necessarily the case in a lot of the other places, right? So that was my takeaway. Tom, I'm sure you have a complementary, if not a different take.
I thought the people we talked to from State Grid were pretty clear that they started out investing in advanced countries, and it turned out, as Ravi said, it was a dead end, partly because there was a lot of competition for new investments from places like pension funds in countries like Canada and Australia, and also the political stuff. So they want to invest overseas. They're being pushed to do so by Chinese government policy. There were first a go outward policy, and then the Belt and Road policy. And Brazil was, I think, something of an accident. They said that because of the global financial crisis, that a European company was obliged to sell assets in Brazil in order to solve their financial problems. And so the Chinese walked in and picked up those assets. And because Brazil also looked good to them for the reasons that Ravi mentioned. And then it worked out well. So they continued to expand their Brazilian operations. Going on to some of the other questions, I believe we may actually have an answer to the question about daily life. This is just speculation, but I noticed that in recent years, the reliability of electricity service in Brazil has increased dramatically. And it's now about the same, the latest Brazilian figures about the same as state grid domestic figures in China. And I think Celio would know more about this than we do, but that's a possibility that state grid may really have had a substantial influence. We were asked about investments in Africa. They have some, not a lot, partly because they're worried about retail. So the state grid people we talked to said the government of Nigeria approached state grid and invited them to get involved in Nigeria, and they looked it over and they decided not to do it. And one of the reasons was that they were going to be facing customers. And our Chinese informants said that it's not a good idea for foreign investors to try direct dealing, communication problems, all sorts of issues. And finally, there was a question about whether investment by companies like State Grid would bring in private Chinese entrepreneurs. And here I have a rather cynical view where our Chinese colleagues, if they were in this conversation, might well disagree. But current Chinese policy talks about integrating private business with state companies. That is one of the platforms of state policy right now. I think it's mostly talk and not reality. So last year, nominal private sector investment in China went up by 1%. In other words, zero growth of private business investment in China. And partly this is because despite rhetoric to the contrary, private businesses are largely frozen out from credit markets. The share of bank loans given to private business dropped from about 50% 10 years ago to about 11% in 2016, and now they stopped publishing the figure, which suggests what's going on more recently. So I think the idea of public-private partnership in China is on the table. It's part of the policy agenda. I don't think it's happening. I think it's a recipe for state firms to suffocate private firms. And I think this is one of the reasons for the rather obvious productivity slowdown. I mean, slowdown of productivity growth in China during the last decade. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Fascinating. Maybe we'll turn it over to Jevon, and then we can come back if there's time at the end of the period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Peters, for the general comments. I just wanted to start out with, there was a question that was asked about the, there was, let me bring this up 1 second. There was a question about Chinese public, slipped me, but essentially they were asking about what about Chinese private actors in the different countries. And in the case of Jamaica, I just wanted to respond that in the last couple of years, we've seen at least 16 different Chinese companies here. And a huge part of the attraction is it relates to local investment infrastructure or general projects. They're getting very lucrative bids. AC Marriott Hotel, they constructed that in the capital. A lot of the universities and the apartment developers are contracting, asking Chinese firms to, carry out the project. And something interesting that I discovered in the research was that when Czech first came to Jamaica, it was the Chinese embassy here who actually introduced a government agency to Czech. And by the time the Jamaica government needed a second project, it was Jamaica who went to China and asked the Chinese president to sort of, help the government to secure financing. And so you can see how the script has flipped somehow to the fact now we are courting Chinese financing in that regard. And it's the same thing happening here with the local private sector, where they are very motivated by issues of cost efficiency, cost saving technology that comes with Chinese financing, and the fact that they're very competitive. and they can give them what they're looking for at lower prices than local contractors. Of course, the local contractors are complaining because they just cannot outbid China on any single project, right? And so a huge part of it goes back to the question around transparency, which essentially a part of the government's complaint, at least what emerged in the Auditor General's report, was that they were not very clear about the pricing mechanisms at which the government agency that agreed with check to finance different infrastructure projects. And so the new framework that came out of the MIDP was that there's a cabinet body that was reviewing on a more thorough basis the bids that were being submitted, not only by check, but by the local contractors whose Chinese financing was paying to execute projects under MIDP. I'm not sure if that clears it up, but just also a general comment on the everyday life impact. Something I try to do, maybe I can be more explicit, but I think to the extent that it has so expanded the road networks and people spend less time in traffic, that what it does for productivity, it's a great signal as to how it has changed everyday life. Maybe I could make another effort to sort of drill it down further and use words like everyday life in the introduction and the segues, but I think that's what I was hinting at.
Thank you, Jevon. Turn it over to Celio.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I will start with this difficult question that Enrique put about the how to separate what is FDI and infrastructure project. Sometimes it's clear when you see some project. It's clear that it's a infrastructure project. Sometimes this infrastructure project it's related with FDI, but sometimes the separation is not so clear. Of course, if you are looking for the different sources, for example, if you are looking at the data from the central bank, you know that what is getting there is information about the flow of exchange rate. Then it's clearly FDI. But for example, in the electric sector, we can compare two projects of state grid. The two lines, transmission lines that was from the Belo Monte to the southeast of Brazil. The first one was led by Eletrobras, but State Grid was the minority partnership, but also was responsible for the project, to construct the project, to lead the project. And the second one, State Grid was responsible for construct, but also was the only one that was exploring after the project. Then in this situation, it's sometimes difficult. If depending on the definition, you can consider that the first one is a project, and the second one is not the same. But I think that the only way to solve this kind of questions is to check and work with several sources of information. Especially, I think that it's very important, this work that you are done in Universidad of Latin America, collecting these individual projects of investment. And you have the information about the employment, the amount of investment, if the enterprise is public or private, and so on. But I think that it's possible to cross this information with some taking the adequate process of analysis of information, cross with the database from World Bank or for central bank, for example. you asked me about what was at the end this structural difficulties to increase infrastructure investment in Brazil. You are right. I was looking at from a macroeconomic perspective, because if you need the infrastructure to contribute to the GDP growth, you have to a very strong process of growth of infrastructure investment, but also you have to combine and have some kind of coordination between several segments of infrastructure, for example, not only in transportation, but also in telecommunication and in oil. You need to combine this several segment of infrastructure to have this kind of boom of infrastructure. And to have this kind of solution, you need to have some kind of capacity and the ability from the state to coordinate this process. And in Brazil, since the 1980s, the Brazilian government have abandoned this strategy, with exception of a very short experience between 2019, after the global financial crisis, and 2013. But it was a very short time. And after, we have again, especially with Temer's government, and also especially with Bolsonaro government, the idea that, so the private sector will take the lead. So it's possible to have, in this context, a lot of projects of investments in infrastructure from Spanish companies, from Chinese companies, but it not will necessarily be a process of contribution to the macroeconomic growth. But of course, you can solve some problems. For example, the mobility in the for the urban population in Brazil, the project of BID and Power China in the metro of São Paulo. So I think that you have this difference between macroeconomic vision that we could relate the infrastructure investment with macroeconomic growth, and microeconomic impacts that it's more related to this solution of more fragmented problems around the country. What is happening in Brazil from the last 5 years is this process of fragmented impacts. Of course, the Chinese investment is important, has a role in that, especially in the electricity sector, also in some other sectors, how I tried to show, but it will not significant. It will not have significant impact on the global capital formation in Brazil. Regarding a question that was in the chat, I think that's from James, about the participation of Chinese banks in Brazil in infrastructure projects. It's interesting that most of the public banks, Chinese banks in Brazil, has supported operations in the oil sector. In the electricity sector, what I found, it was the BNDES that was the main financing. And even in the more recent projects, for example, in the light rail vehicle in Salvador and in São Paulo, the financing was from I think that it was from IABB in Salvador and from CAF in São Paulo. It was very interesting. It was not the Chinese banks that was supporting this. What we have found in the research about the Chinese financing in the 2019 project with Enrique is what the commercial banks of Chinese commercial banks in Brazil was basically supporting the activities of Chinese companies supporting trade and basically was giving some support for the Chinese companies that was entering in Brazil. Focus on trade transaction, especially exports of commodities and agricultural products. We found just one project that was financed by ICBC in Brazil. That was the port of São Luís in infrastructure projects.
I think since we are running short of time, I'll turn it over to Omar for just a few minutes. And I'm sure these are points that will come up again for discussion tomorrow, and we can carry them forward there. So Omar, a few minutes for your response.
Well, thank you for all the comments. The first one about the foreign investments. Maybe I need to add a section saying that this port is made in a venture between a mining Peruvian company, Volcan, which is sharing 40% of the project, and shipping, which is 60%. But the important thing is that Volcan as well has been investing in some infrastructure project around the Chancay area. So it's not part of I need a partner to do a business. It's more about a territorial strategy. But the truth is as well that there is not enough mineral large project around to found a project. So it means that you also probably need, another strategy rather than say I'm the owner and I need this port for my services. So I need basically to explore, which led me to your second point about other Chinese port infrastructure project in Latin America. Maybe that will help me to understand what are the relationship between a Chinese port company and a local one. What are the behaviors in terms of shareholder, in terms of if their goals are complementary to the private local companies or to the government. So I think this will be really useful for set up at the end what are the really ambitions of this project. I use the everyday life position, which I think it was clear to know that it's something that I cannot demand to the project. I need probably more to demand to the national authorities. And this project opens some opportunity windows to say, okay, if you have some technology, Chinese investment and infrastructure have evolved in terms of mega infrastructure using more sustainable approach, probably you could transfer this technology to avoid damage as we could expect from a local project. So, but I think this topic of what are the role of foreign investment in this particular project and in the topic of ports in Latin America will help to explore as well this in terms of further policy outputs on the territory.
Thank you very much. Wonderful insights and really perceptive responses. And I can certainly say, as an outsider, without expertise in either China or Latin America, I have learned a tremendous amount, and it's really a testament to the ability to present the material, to be able to give a perspective on these complex issues. So unfortunately, we have run out of time for today. The topics, of course, will carry us forward into a discussion tomorrow where many of these themes will be brought up again. And under normal circumstances, we would all go out for a wonderful dinner in Pittsburgh or Mexico or Kingston or wherever we are. And I truly wish that we were able to do that. And sooner or later, we certainly will. But I wanted to thank you all for wonderful presentations this afternoon and for carrying the conversation on this important topic. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Enrique.